Good afternoon. Welcome to this session. My name is Brice Lalonde. I am a former environment minister, former climate change negotiator. And today we're going to talk right now about a very mysterious, fascinating, and scaring topic, which is solar radiation management. We don't know what's the outcome of the Glasgow conference, which is still right on now. And if these negotiations go wrong, if the emissions continue to climb, what's going to happen? What can we do? Have we a sort of a technological fix? Well, actually, we do. But this fix, this new topic, this project raises huge scientific, political, and ethical questions. So we're going to talk about it. We have the chance of having today with us very interesting panelist, specialist of the question. We have Andy Parker. Andy Parker is the CEO of the Degrees Initiative. He's actually teaching solar radiation management to lots of countries, and he's going to teach it to us right now in a few seconds. We have Stanley Robinson. He's a very famous American writer, a novelist, and he's been writing a lot of books. And the last book, The Ministry for the Future, is all about this. Climate change is running, is going, and we have to do something about it. Well, one country has done it, and he has described it in his book. But he also is a specialist of how do you change planets to make them habitable for humans. So he's going to talk about it. And we have, of course, Janus Pastor right up there. Janus Pastor, I would say he's a specialist of international multilateral governance. He's been working with the United Nations. He's a companion of the United Nations. Right since the first Rio 92 conference, where he was member of the staff, and he wrote the agenda for 21, what we all should have done and probably did not do. So there we are. We should have had also somebody from the American DOE, the Department of Energy, but he couldn't make it. So Andy, could you please start and tell us, first of all, what is solar radiation management? What's it all about? Can you describe the project? Tell the people who are listening to us what it is about? So do we have a problem here with you, Andy Parker? I can see your picture.
You'll have my voice.
You.
Yeah, you'll have
okay,
my voice, but not my moving picture. So yes, solar radiation management, also known as solar geoengineering or climate remediation, climate intervention. It is a super controversial proposal for reducing some of the risks of climate change by reflecting some sunlight back out into space. For instance, by spraying tiny reflective aerosols into the stratosphere, where they would circulate the planet on stratospheric winds, reflect away sunlight, and replicate the natural cooling effect of volcanoes. And this idea is super controversial because it has the potential to be extremely helpful, and it's got the potential to be totally disastrous. No one yet knows which, and so the stakes are extremely high.
So, okay, I suppose people would understand. And what's interesting with this technology or with this project is it's rather cheap. It seems to be rather easy to do. So actually, you just spread your aerosols in the stratosphere where they stay there for quite a long time. Eventually, they sort of fall down after and create acid rains. But is it possible to do that in just one country? I mean, can a country decide to do that and keep the aerosols in its borders? No, it's probably going to slide away and cover the whole of the earth. Is that possible or not? I mean, where's the scientific consensus or finding about it?
Well, there's no scientific consensus as yet. It's still early in the research stages, and so the scientists who work on this are still trying to characterize the technology to understand its basic influences on things like rainfall around the world. What does this mean for sea level rise, for extreme temperatures and storms in the tropics, and so on? So I wouldn't say there's a scientific consensus on anything beyond the idea that it could cool the planet down. And that is well understood because volcanoes test the idea idea for us once every 50 years or so. When a large volcano erupts in the tropics, it blasts sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, that circles the planet on stratospheric winds, and the planet cools down following a large eruption. So one can be confident that SRM could reduce global temperatures. The rest of the evidence we have typically comes from modeling work. So using computer models to investigate how SRM might affect things that matter, as I said, rainfall, storm, and so on, and trying to understand what the benefits and the drawbacks might be.
And thank you, Andy. Okay, and so you're about your project, your Degrees initiative is all about explaining that to people from all countries of the world so that everybody is aware of it.
The Degrees Initiative, our goal is to build the capacity of developing countries so that they can make their own minds up about solar geoengineering. It's not about telling them what to think. So we run workshops in developing countries to get new voices into the conversation, and we support research in the Global South through our Decimals Research Fund. And Decimals supports teams of scientists across the developing world as they ask their own research questions about SRM, generate their own evidence. What does this mean for instance, extreme temperatures in Indonesia? Well, one of the Decimals teams is researching that. What does this mean for droughts in southern Africa or dust storms in the Middle East? Well, there are teams in Iran and South Africa answering those questions right now. And ultimately, the goal of the Degrees Initiative is to make sure developing countries are central to any decisions that get made about SRM, how to govern it, whether it ultimately gets used or rejected.
Right, thank you. Well, let's turn to Stanley Robinson. Stan, you've just written a Ministry for the Future, and Ministry for the Future starts by a terrible heat wave in India, and India decides to go to solar radiation management, and without asking other countries and saying, well, listen, if you were in my place, what would you do? There's millions of people who are dying. We have to do something. So we've done it. So it makes you actually one of the only persons who really sort of have experienced this technology. So it's funny because what you have done also in your Mars trilogy is about terraforming, making Mars habitable for humans. So you are sort of a specialist of geoengineering, I would say. So tell us what's happening in your book and what are the results of this solar radiation management first experience?
Sure, and thank you for this. In my novel, I had recently learned about the possibility of wet bulb 35 temperatures being fatal to human beings, no matter if they had a fan on them and had no clothes on and were in the shade, they would still die of overheating. And so you would have to have an electrical grid working to put people in air conditioning to survive temperature humidity combination like that. And it seems to me that this is a signal that we have to decarbonize as fast as we can, because we're hitting wet bulb 34. We're getting into dangerous temperature humidity combinations that will kill people outright. One of the places most at danger is India. They have the back wall of the Himalayas that will trap heat waves. They have 1 billion people. They have a somewhat uncertain electrical grid. So it seemed to me that the story needed to be told. And I think it's entirely likely that if a country suffers a mass heat death, they want the temperatures down immediately. And this solar radiation management has been proposed. And as Andy described, it's a workable method. The analogy to volcanoes is good, but not it teaches us some things. We might want to put up some other dust that isn't sulfur dioxide so that it wouldn't create acid rain, something like limestone dust, the dusts that are up there, rather than volcanic explosive dust. We also know that 5 years later, things would be back to normal because that dust would fall to the ground. And this is what has happened after Pinatubo and the other volcanoes. So I can very well see a desperate country thinking, this doesn't solve all problems, but it at least lowers the temperature for a few years so that we can collect ourselves and see if there are better solutions than this temporary fix, this lowering of temperatures. And I think it is important to emphasize the temporary nature of it, because there are arguments going on that, oh, you would have to keep it going forever, which I don't think is quite true. And people think, it will go too far and it'll put us into an ice age. I don't think that's possible. So the discussion of it has been random and sensationalist, and it seemed important to me to try to tell the story as straight as I could in terms of what could very likely happen if we don't decarbonize with extreme rapidity, which, looking at Glasgow, it seems like we won't. So having a little bit of an emergency escape from mass death, you can see why it's being discussed now.
Thank you very much. But I mean, for instance, you say it's not permanent, but if it would stay 5 years in the air, when it goes down, suddenly the heat is going to go up very fast, and we're going to have a heat wave at that moment. So probably you should need to put some more.
No. I mean, I think I know what you're saying, but the return to normal temperatures will be. It probably will be fast, but it won't go any higher than it would have been otherwise. And there might even be some mitigating factors of cooler temperatures for 5 years might help to lead us to feedback loops where it would not even get as hot as it had before. The modeling is not clear on this because models are just models, and it depends what you put in at the front of the model. But I don't think that people need to worry that you are permanently committed to this action if you just do it once. I don't think that's right. Now, I am just a writer. I'm listening to the scientists on this. So I'm really just reporting. It's not my opinion. It's just what I'm hearing from people.
Yes, but it's very interesting to see that you have to have a novelist to warn people. I mean, to have a wake up call must come from a novelist, because it's true that this has been, we've been hearing about geoengineering for quite a time now, and we are quite surprised to see that it's not yet introduced. So we're going to get to our next panelist, because after all, in your novel, India suddenly goes and decides to do it, and there's no multilateral or no discussion with the neighbors or with the international community. And I think this is why Janos is coming here, because Janos is trying to work in how do we introduce this question into the international community's discussion. And for instance, it's true, Glasgow is not working well, doesn't seem to be going well. So it seems we seem to be doomed, condemned to having always higher emissions until really at one moment people of the planet decide to do something. And it's interesting just to you again, Stan, because you are also interested in politics, I would say, in ethics, politics, and perhaps you think that if we want to get there, perhaps we have to change our politics system. I don't know. We have to see that later. Janos, how do we do to get people involved in the international community? How do we do to introduce this very important question inside of the international multilateral structure?
Well, thank you, Brice, and thank you for inviting me for this discussion, and I really look forward to this. I think a few thoughts that I was going to share with this group, I think they follow very well from Andy's introduction and then following Stan's description of his book. And the question we need to ask ourselves is how far the book is from actual reality. And the fact is that the world is heading to a much higher temperature. And even if Glasgow fully succeeds, and we don't know yet, we'll know it in the next few hours, the best scenario is now 1.8 degrees, which is a lot more than what is good. And most likely we'll end up, we're heading to a 2 to 3 degree world. And that could be catastrophe. And that's the kind of scenario where we might get the kind of situations that Stan describes in his book. Now, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has been very clear that to reach our temperature goals, we will need massive and transformative emission reductions. And we also need to do gigaton per annum scale removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that report, the IPCC report, is also very clear that both of these will be challenging. And we see that because they're not happening as much as one needs. And therefore, some scientists say that we may need to think about this solar radiation modification or solar geoengineering, as some people call it. And even the IPCC acknowledges that it could work, but there are many governance challenges. Now, the question is not to be posed is not whether the solar radiation modification is risky or not, because truly we know it is risky, but the real question is whether the world will be better off or worse off if this technique were to be used in case the world is indeed going toward much higher temperatures. And it's not easy to answer this question. There isn't enough evidence yet either way, and that's part of the problem. And as Andy said at the beginning, it's very difficult to talk about some of these issues because solar radiation modification, especially the stratospheric aerosol injection type, are very controversial issues. Now, what we have been doing in our initiative is to promote conversations about these. And the reason why we need to promote conversations is because there are many different issues at stake. There are, of course, environmental risk, socio-political, economic issues, security issues, even ethical, philosophical questions. And the reality is that there are different views and interpretations of these issues of people dependent on their geography, on their culture, on their economic status, their religion, and so on. And that makes the discussions difficult, but that's why we need to have them. And then there's also the moral hazard that we don't want to end up in a situation where we start even talking about this technology, these techniques, then it stops us from doing what we really have to do, which is to reduce emissions and remove carbon as soon as possible. Now, much of the conversation has been taking place in the global north, so that's part of the problem. And that's why it's so important that the work that Andy is doing previously in SRMGI and now with the Degrees Initiative to engage developing country views in this process. Now, as Andy said, this is fundamentally a global challenge, and we would be manipulating the global atmosphere. That would affect everybody, perhaps, and also future generations, and most likely not necessarily equally. And it's fundamentally a cross-sectoral issue. It's not just about climate, it's about food, it's about health, it's about geopolitical security issues, it's about the whole thing. And the challenge that we're facing is that there is no home, no institutional home, no process where one could easily discuss or consider these issues. So, as a result of this, we at the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, our strategic approach has been to try to catalyze consideration of this in the UN General Assembly, because this is able to look at this in a cross-sectoral manner, and all countries have a seat at the table. We're impartial about the content of what might come out of that consideration. The real purpose that we have is to make sure that the issues are addressed, to encourage learning and understanding. Now, we have been catalyzing and being quite active in the past in a number of processes, intergovernmental and others, UN Environment Assembly, UN Regional Bodies, Arctic Council, Pacific Islands Forum, just to name a few. But catalyzing something in the General Assembly would be something particularly special. And so we're working on this, and we need to find a way to frame, and the governments, the member states of the UN, will need to find a way to suitably frame solar radiation modification that can be addressed in the UN General Assembly. And it's not about deciding yes or no, or at this point, it's too early for that, but to learn and to better understand, and how it links to the broader agendas of sustainable development, security, migration, etc. So we're currently engaging member states via their missions to the UN in New York, but also increasingly in capital cities. And what we're hearing is that there's obviously mixed feelings about the potential one-day use of, or not, of solar radiation modification. There are different views on that, but in reality, there is very little knowledge about this technique, and there's little knowledge about the risks, benefits, and governance challenges. But there is a clear and unanimous interest in pursuing conversation. So that's encouraging, and we hope that that will help in moving this debate forward.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. You'll tell us after how do you really try to introduce this in the General Assembly of the United Nations and tell us if the General Assembly of the United Nations is very efficient. Not always very efficient, I suppose, because it takes a long time to have all these 195 countries to agree, of course, which is very difficult. But it's probably the only place which we have for the time being.
We live in a rather imperfect world, Brice, and in an imperfect world, even some not so perfect bodies can actually do some miracles.
You're right. And can I come back to you? I would like, I have some sort of a scientific question. We have models, and everybody talking, and you said we have these models, and Stan talked about the models we have, but models don't replace experience, of course. And so, is it something wise to do to go on and to trust models for such an important, I mean, and scaring technology? For instance, if you reflect some light of the sun, is that going to have some effect on the plants and on photosynthesis and things like that? I don't know, because we need to have also food. We need to feed 8 billion people, etc. So it seems to me tricky. Is the science moving fast enough on that sort of project, Andy?
Yeah, these are good and big questions. Whether the science is moving fast enough, personally, I would say no. I don't think we have anywhere near the evidence base that we would want to have in order to make an informed decision as to whether to use or to reject SRM. And so for me, the science needs to move a lot faster, not just the science, the social science as well. We need to understand the socio-political implications of this technology. On whether we should trust the models or not, well, to a certain extent, we already trust the models when it comes to climate projections, and so I think we should. We are proposing to overhaul much of the global economy based on projections about what will happen if we don't, if we fail to decarbonize, and I think that's rational risk management. And ultimately, we're likely to face the same situation at some point with solar geoengineering, in that to some extent we're going to have to trust the models that have been done before and balance the risk, as János so correctly put it, balance the risk of doing solar geoengineering, the unquestioned risks of deliberately blocking out the sun to cool the planet. They have to be balanced against the risks of not doing that, whatever our state of decarbonisation, and allowing the temperatures to continue rising. There's no one alive today who knows whether it's a greater risk to pass 2 degrees C of warming or to dim the sun to stay below 2C. But that is likely to be the sort of dismal dilemma that policymakers are going to face within the next 2 or 3 decades. And so, no, I don't think the science is going fast enough. That decision is going to arrive at our doorsteps, whether we want it to or not. And my view is that more information will help us make more informed decisions.
Thank you. What you said is very important, because after all, California, Australia, they are burning. So I mean, I don't know when too much is going to be enough to start doing something else, or at least to decide to reduce emissions. Now, it's this technology, this project, if it's just sending a plane high in the air to send aerosols, it's quite cheap, and that's one of the risks. It's cheaper to do that than to reduce emissions. So probably we should agree, all of us, to say that at least there is one condition before doing that, is you have to start reducing emissions worldwide, I suppose. What do you think, Andy?
That would certainly be my preference. Yeah, indeed. I wouldn't describe solar geoengineering as cheap. Cheap is a tricky term. It can mean easily afforded, or it can mean less costly than. Solar geoengineering, SRM, is likely not easily afforded for the majority of the world's nations. It's likely to cost billions or tens of billions per year. Certainly projected to be less costly than the climate damages, or the projected damages from climate change and sea level rise. But I think cheap is a very tricky word in this area. Again, I'd come back to what János advised. One has to compare the costs and the risks and the benefits of using SRM with the costs, risks, benefits of a world without it. But I think we're in difficult territory the moment we start to compare cutting emissions with solar geoengineering. Scientists are really clear. It's not an alternative. It may be a complement to really aggressive emissions cuts and attempt to adapt to the new climate. But everyone's clear it cannot and will not be an alternative.
Yes, we all agree on that, except that probably people won't agree somewhere, because it's what we used to call a technological fix, which helps us not to really address the real good questions. But I mean, there we are. So I see Janos wants to say a word, so let's make it alive. Janos, please.
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize something what Andy alluded to, but to make it clear that solar radiation modification cannot be a solution to the climate crisis. The solution to the climate crisis is reducing the emissions to zero and then going net negative. The challenge is that it's all happening too slowly, and in the meantime, the planet is heating, and who knows how many people will be exposed to the wet bulb 35 that Stan mentioned at the beginning. And that is the challenge. And therefore, if ever one considers solar radiation modification, we need to think about it as something that we're doing while we're trying to do everything else possible to actually solve the climate crisis.
Yes, are we really doing that? Stan, what do you think? I mean, look at what's happening in Glasgow. It's very slow. Haven't you written something on the withering, on the people who are hesitating, procrastinating, and everything?
Yes, but one has to acknowledge that the whole world is now thinking about this in a way that they weren't a decade ago. So I would never trust the timelines in my older novels. Everything's happening faster. Even Ministry for the Future has a timeline that is wrong already. Things are happening faster. So I think the moral hazard argument is coming from people who are still imagining that there are forces in the world who are want to keep on burning carbon so much that they also want to get away with it. That may be true, but the mainstream of world opinion is that we have to decarbonize as fast as we can, and that the IPCC report from August was absolutely determinative and undeniable. So there's very little climate denial going on. There's more people trying to hold on to their money streams longer and see if they can get away with it. I wanted to say, though, beyond the moral hazard argument, which I think is an argument from, say, 1995 that's no longer relevant, we also have some analogies to solar radiation management that means that it's more than modeling, not just the volcanic eruptions, but there was a thing that used to be called the Asian brown cloud. It was centered over Southern Asia, because of because of coal plants and other polluting activities.
Yes.
That depressed temperatures in South Asia by a couple of degrees, even though these were not up in the stratosphere and they didn't spread worldwide. They were regional. It's at least something that you can learn from them. And also Beijing, on a normal day, they've got 400 parts per million of particulates in their air. When they close down their coal plants because they want the city clean, the city's air is clean just a week later and temperatures rise. So there are reasons to think that as like the emergency fire extinguisher, if we get into a situation where there are mass deaths happening and people are desperate, then the more that we know about this process, the more we'll be able, and the more we have governance of it, as Janos has been pointing out, the more the world community can say, look, we need to lower temperatures for a few years here and then fix everything else as fast as we can, because decarbonizing and carbon drawdown, going carbon negative, that's going to have to happen. And the sooner it happens, the better. So it's very important to put all of these factors on the table in a larger discussion. Partly when scientists are saying we might have to throw dust into the atmosphere to cool it down, this is like inventing the name the Anthropocene. It's scientists saying we're entering an emergency. They're trying to wave the red flag. They're trying to pull the alarm button in a hotel that's burning down. They're trying to hit the alarm button every way they can, and that's what that IPCC report from August was. Given the state of the danger involved, then we really have to have all possible mitigations and ameliorations of the situation on the table and fully discussed.
In your book, Stan, you insist also on the ethical and political issue, saying that it's probably going to be difficult to get into these projects and to have an international agreement if we don't have some sort of, I would say, more collective and more value, I would say, added civilization or political system and things like that. So it's interesting in your book because not only do you have the Ministry of the Future for the future, sorry, but you also have warriors which are more clandestine and things like that. And so the question is, how do we add all these forces to try to avoid probably solar radiation management and reduce the emissions? Why is it that we still haven't got into the reduction trajectory?
If you're asking me, I think it's very clear that the fossil fuel industries have bought political representation in governments all around the world. And also, very importantly, and I think people need to be clear on this, most of the fossil fuels that are in the ground now are owned by nation states. They are not private holdings of companies like Exxon or Royal Dutch Shell. That's only 20% of the fossil fuels. The rest are the assets of nation states that are sovereign, and they consider those fossil fuels to be part of their income stream and their national security. They don't want those fossil fuels to become stranded assets that are utterly useless. So you speak of the ethics of it, and you'll excuse me if I think that also means the finance of it, because money is an expression of our values. The petrostates include Canada, Mexico, the United States, Australia, Russia, Brazil, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia. It goes on and on. These countries depend, Nigeria, they depend on their petrodollars to stay solvent and to keep their citizens employed. They would go into a Great Depression that would beggar the Great Depression if we were to suddenly strand fossil fuels as a valued commodity, as a source of a money stream. So here's what I'm leading up to. We're going to have to pay the petrostates to keep it in the ground. Now, this will be complicated. It will look like extortion and blackmail. People will scream about it, but we all use those fossil fuels. We're still using them. These weren't villains it was us, civilization, who did it, and we used it. We've all benefited from fossil fuel burning. Now we can't burn it anymore, but we can't throw millions of people out of work and throw the world into a world depression, or the inequity gets worse and worse. The sheer human misery gets worse from that angle. So an accommodation is going to have to be made. And really, the Paris Agreement, the General Assembly, the UN, which of course the IPCC is part of also, that's the only forum we have for discussing these issues. As weak as it is where everybody gets together to talk. And I think it's going to have to be put onto the table that there's going to have to be carbon finance of huge proportions, of trillions of dollars per year, that will put people to work decarbonizing as a public project, and that also will allow the petrostates to get a discounted, haircutted income stream like they might have gotten if they had actually sold the fossil fuels, but they're going to be paid to keep it in the ground. It's a little shocking, I think, to think of it that way, but I don't see any other way out of it.
Stan, you know what that happened? That was a proposal from Ecuador. Ecuador, a few years ago, I don't know if Janos remembers, had oil in his national park called the Yasuni. And they offered the world to pay us and we'll keep it in the ground. But it did not work out. And of course, it was quite funny in your book to see that Arabia, no more Saudi Arabia, but Arabia was as rich as before because it was paid to keep it in the ground. So probably, but it's a good idea. I mean, we're having discussion about carbon markets. And for instance, if we have quotas of disappearing carbon or pumped from the atmosphere and put into the ground, if we had a market on that, we could pay much more easier the people who are starting to carbon engineering or others to pump the carbon out of the air, and even to create these sustainable aviation fuels, which are much more expensive than the fossil ones. So yes, your idea is probably very inspiring. It could inspire the negotiators, I would say. So perhaps this is Janos now, because Janos is the specialist of all the United Nations negotiations. So is what Stan says, is that a foreseeable a future possible, you think, to pay the petrol, the oil states to keep the oil in the ground?
Well, as you said, Brice, the Yasuni example is a very good one because it was relatively small and it didn't happen. It just simply didn't happen. There were no buyers. And I'm afraid the way the current international order has been set up, it hasn't been very good at paying others, at compensating or helping the totality of the world to move in a certain direction. Yet, I think what Stan said really highlights this issue that this is not about solar panels. This is not about electric cars. This is not about bits and pieces. It's about a big picture of how the world is going to survive. And it's about how can the world and the 200 odd countries begin to work together in a way that they just simply haven't done up till now. And that will mean transfers of resources. It will cost. It's not going to happen free. All these new technologies, they're great, but they cost money. And you know, when you displace a coal miner, you have to do something with a coal miner too. We've seen in the case of Germany how expensive it is currently to actually pay for the transition of the coal miners to do something else. So these are the realities that the world is facing, and it cannot be looked at in a simple silo of climate change, of health, of environment. But we have to look at the totality of economic development, of strategic considerations. Makes it very, very difficult. But that is why I still believe, in spite of the imperfect world that we do live in, and the challenge of multilateral institutions and multilateral processes, I still believe it is possible to do. We have seen examples of success over even more recently when there are different actors that are challenging the multilateral system. So I think it's possible. It requires leadership. It requires leadership from governments. It requires leadership from non-state actors, from civil society organizations, private sector, and so on. Really dare to say clearly how challenging, how difficult, how crisis-like situation we're really in. So the bad news on the one hand, but at the same time be positive about the opportunities that we have. And if I can, I'm of course, we'll see until the Glasgow meeting is over. But so far, I'm not tremendously impressed by all the positive outcomes. But what is positive, I think, is all the different commitments that are being made by the different stakeholders, private sector, local authorities, etc. What we need now is to find better ways to channel these into what governments are doing and how all this is going to be. How they can all be accountable. So I think there are possibilities, and I still believe that if we can have some kind of initial discussion in a situation like the UN General Assembly, where one can look at these different dimensions and governments start thinking about how you bring these things together and how can you actually make sure that we don't end up in that kind of health and environmental crisis, but at the same time recognize that it requires economic transfers and development issues. Maybe we can move forward. It won't be perfect, I know, but I'm confident that it's possible.
That's great. Okay. Well, I suppose we're all working for that, and Andy, you're working especially for that because you want to involve all the developing countries. It's very difficult because developing countries, for instance, right now, in Glasgow, they're asking for money. And you are more on the technological side. How do you train people? How do you explain what the situation is? I don't know. As being a negotiator, I was also impressed by the fact that the G20 was as efficient as the General Assembly sometimes, because when you have the 20 countries which are sending the most of the carbon dioxide, and if they decide together to do something, at least probably the others would follow. But I mean, we have to use all the ways we can. But what's interesting is, Andy, what is the answer of the people or your trainees? What do they say when you talk about this and when they learn about it and when they can completely address this question. What is the feeling you have encountered in your meetings?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing to say, we've run over 20 workshops across the developing world over 7 or 8 years. And the first thing to say is that there is as wide a range of views of SRM in the Global South as when you run one of these sessions in London, which should come as a surprise to no one. Some people absolutely hate the idea. Some people are cautiously optimistic. Most are in the muddled middle where they recognize that it has the potential to be useful and recognize that it's got the potential to be terrible. If there is a difference between the Global South and the Global North that I have noticed as part of these engagement workshops, it is perhaps a pragmatism over climate change that we find in the Global South more commonly than in the Global North. So what I've noticed is an openness to the consideration of SRM, not an enthusiasm for using it. It's very clearly very risky, but an openness to consideration as a potential way to reduce climate risks while we cut emissions. I think that this comes from the realization that climate change is not a remote, abstract, and distant threat, but climate change is something that's knocking on the door right now. We've seen, the most powerful storm recorded in the Philippines this year, the terrible forest fires in Algeria. You don't need me to keep going through these examples. And so I think for the countries on the front lines of climate change, particularly where there isn't a sense of historical guilt over emissions, there is a willingness to consider ideas like SRM, consider as in to research it, to think about governance, not to go and use it. I've not encountered any enthusiasm for the use of SRM, but to consider it. And certainly developing countries want to have their say when it comes to decision-making time, whenever that may be.
Yes, I see. Not long ago, we had discussions with pioneer of geoengineering, and at that time it was considered that pumping out CO2 from the atmosphere was also called geoengineering. At that time, I thought it was much easier or much more sympathetic to pump the CO2 out of the air than to go and dim the solar light. And it's quite interesting to see that pumping CO2 from the atmosphere is now starting. It's now starting. You have companies doing it. They are transforming it into fuel for aviation or things like that. Some are putting it down in the basalt to get it becoming a rock, etc., etc. So things actually are moving on the geoengineering, I would say, side. And I suppose, I hope, I hope, like in Stan's book, there will be a turning point on the Kellogg's curve in Manao on the CO2 in the atmosphere, and suddenly it's going to go down. And at that time, I suppose we'll be much more ready to perhaps to agree on some solar heat management somewhere. We have a certain amount of questions also, so I don't know if it's time to get to the Q&A, but some people said, what are the limits of solar radiation modification? Does it have a long-term negative impact on the environment? So you had already answered to that, Stan. Does somebody want to answer on that question specifically? Long-term effects of solar heat management, of solar radiation management? None? Yes, please.
I can have a go. I can have a go. It's one of the areas of large uncertainties, like many other areas. And I would say the uncertainties over what SRM does in the very long term are enormous, as are the uncertainties about what happens if we allow global temperatures to rise above 2C and stay that way for decades or centuries. And so we're going to keep coming back to this. It's another of these risk paradigms, and one that we have to work out as much as possible before making the decision to use or to reject SRM.
Thank you. That's very clear. Now we have another question, which is a very obvious one. Do you think solar radiation modification from a country A could have negative consequences on a country B, causing bilateral issues? Well, Janos.
Well, First of all, if you do the stratospheric aerosol injection type solar radiation modification, it will have global impacts. It will impact everybody, even if it's done unilaterally by one particular country. So country A will affect B and 194 other countries. Now, will that or could that result in tensions between countries? Absolutely so. And this is the kind of situation where already if there are perhaps tensions between two countries and then one of them gets involved in solar radiation modification and then there are changes to the regional climate and let's say the monsoons are late or whatever, then even if you cannot prove that it was because of the solar radiation modification, the perception will be there, and that itself is enough to cause tensions. That's why earlier, when I tried to describe some of the basic elements, the issue of global security is a very important component of thinking and discussing about these issues.
Thank you very much. This goes directly to the last question I have right now, which is exactly what you said, Janos, is what will be the impact of solar radiation mitigation on peace processes? What are the dangers beyond the immediate potential environmental impact? So, this question goes to the obvious question we always had in these climate negotiations. If you have a global threat, it's either international global cooperation, either the war of everyone against everyone. I mean, and this is where we also with this technology. I mean, is what you described in your book, Stan. But luckily, it went well after. So the Indian experience did not have too bad consequences on the neighbors.
Yes, well, as Janos said, it will be a global effect. So the world will all have the temperatures go down in many, many countries of the world. That would be a positive thing to have happen. And it would only last for a while, and then people will discuss it again, whether it was worth doing. The implications, one of the most impressive pavilions at COP up in Glasgow was assembled by a group of scientists who represented the cryosphere. So most of the pavilions were national, but this was the cryosphere as if it were a nation or a developing country. And really, if the temperatures get high enough, and I mean like 2 degrees, then we've lost the ice on the planet, even including Antarctica and especially Greenland. And at that point, every single coastal city on Earth is inundated by massive sea level rise, and we're in terrible trouble. Humanitarian trouble, the suffering would be extreme, the expense would be extreme, to the point where spending $100 billion to put dust up in the atmosphere to cool the temperatures for a few years will look trivial compared to the cost of the damages. So it's true what Andy says. The risk assessments are bizarre because you have to look at some events are low probability but incredibly high damage if it happens. Others, like the loss of the Earth's ice, are not at all low probability. They are high probability when they also have extreme damages. So we really are in a fix. And one thing about Glasgow that was encouraging was that I think the representatives of the world realize it. The fossil fuels that we have in the ground, if you were to put a price on them now, entirely hypothetical, as if you were selling them as oil today, I figured it would be something like $1,600 trillion. So that sounds really big, and it is. It's maybe 20 years of the world's economy. And yet all of that supposed value of burning that carbon has to be stranded and given up on. So the necessity of a new a post-capitalist financial regime that governments together impose, and maybe it will be the G2, maybe the G7, maybe the G20, maybe the whole General Assembly. There's going to have to be a working political majority to agree to pay to do the necessary, and it's going to be expensive. So you see in Glasgow that some of the biggest stumbling blocks are merely the developed countries trying to agree to give the money they already promised to the developing countries, The G77 is not impressed. 100 billion was promised. Only 20 billion has actually been paid out, and the rest of it was just accounting tricks. Well, the budget for the sewage disposal system of New York City is like $15 billion a year. So at this point, the money is just ridiculously inadequate to the problem. And the last thing I want to say is that geoengineering as a term, if you include pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, if you include putting iron filings into the ocean, and then you include solar radiation management, you've put three radically different things under the same name. It does not help to do that. They each have their own dangers and benefits. And I think one of the most useful things that Andy and Janos and that whole community is doing is to say solar radiation management is its own particular thing and needs to be thought about as an emergency gesture. Pulling carbon out of the atmosphere looks harmless and necessary, and it's just that it's incredibly expensive and slow. But as a leftist, I would just say the knee-jerk reaction against geoengineering is not helping the world. The knee-jerk reaction against nuclear is not helping the world. I can't speak for Andrew Light, who isn't here in this meeting, although he tried to, but I met him in Glasgow, and he was very open, and he's U.S. Department of Energy and State Department, and he was very open to considering anything. And he's a member of the Biden administration. I think everybody has to learn from him and think we have to now be open to everything because we are in an all-hands-on-deck emergency. And all of the old truisms, like, oh, nuclear bad, oh, geoengineering bad, they need to be thrown out the window, and we have to rethink everything.
Thank you very much. I agree with that. By the way, I visited the cryosphere booth in in Glasgow, and I gave them an advice. I said to them, read Stanley's book. It's because you were talking about pumping the water under the ice glaciers of the Antarctic,
yeah,
and putting it over to freeze. And I thought that was very interesting.
Yes, and can I say that the scientists that were listed on the bottom of all those posters, I knew about half of them. That's a small community. The cryosphere community of scientists is rather small, and a good paper has already been published in Nature magazine. I didn't even know about it, about pumping water from the bottom of the glaciers, which, since it's regional, maybe it's not geoengineering, but again, the term is worthless. The ice scientists are, of course, freaked out, and I'm glad you saw that pavilion. It was certainly maybe the most terrifying of all the many scary pavilions. That was the one that struck me the strongest.
Yes. In any case, I think what you say about throwing away all our old ideas or prejudice is very important politically and very difficult to do because of the inertia of political systems, of ideas and things like that. But it's completely true that climate change should have changed everything because it's so important and so difficult and so planetary, I would say. Planetary politics are very late now, and we need to invent them. And this is something that Janos has been trying to do. I've been trying to do. I suppose Andy also. How can we invent fair planetary policies right now? It's so important right now. Now, there was a last question. I mustn't forget the last question. Is the SRM technology applicable in all regions of the world, or must it be adapted to local climate conditions? Andy, perhaps you should answer that one.
As currently conceived, it's not just applicable, it's inevitable in all regions of the world. If a single actor were to spray aerosols into the stratosphere, assuming they did it in both hemispheres, then the aerosols circle the planet on the stratospheric winds. They will cool down all areas will be affected. There is no there's no opting out of this. And that's a benefit and a curse. It's a benefit in the entire planet working together on this. It's a curse in that one country could choose to do it on behalf of everyone.
But is the risk of these aerosols, these dust, to concentrate in one place and completely darken the sky, while the other places would not be, they would not have the aerosol on top of them? Is there that sort of risk of concentration?
That's not a risk that I've heard of. I'm not a scientist, though. My background's in science policy. My understanding is that no, you wouldn't get one area that was particularly darkened compared to all the rest if it was using a stratospheric technique. It can be localized if you keep the reflection close to the surface of the planet. So people have suggested brightening the built environment, which is a terrific idea if you want to reduce heat in cities. It's a terrible idea if you want to reduce the planetary temperature. They've suggested putting white sheets perhaps on the desert. Again, if you could do it, it would be a terrible idea.
Listen, thank you so much. Now, we're coming to an end because sessions have to come to an end. I would like to thank you very much. And I think, Janos, you're going to have the last word, if you don't mind, the others, because you're going to tell us what you're going to do in the next year. We have to get this introduced in the General Assembly. When is it going to come?
Well, we are working very hard on that, and we are now consulting with representatives of countries, with the UN missions in New York, in capitals, to try to have a discussion and to see what could work in terms of framing this topic for potential consideration in the UN General Assembly. So we're working, and we'll see how this goes. But at the same time, there are also discussions by some to raise this issue in the UN Environment Assembly in February, March of next year. And UNEP has potentially a very important role to play in this area in terms of looking after the techniques and the risks, the benefits, who is doing what, the kind of basic information, the way they do so well in the gap reports on emissions, the gap report on adaptation, and so on and so forth. So I think there are different things that one needs to work on. There's not a single approach that will work. Not a single international process and international organization that will work. And just one last word, if I may, coming back a little bit to the discussion on moral hazard. And I don't disagree with what Stan said. There's a lot of old thinking there. But we still need to deal with it because a lot of people think about it. But there is another side to moral hazard. Not doing it, not looking at these issues, not talking about them, actually will stop the world from having potentially access to a technique that might actually be critical in solving one part of the problems that face humanity. So moral hazard can go both ways. And let's be very careful that we don't fall just on one side or the other.
I think this should be the end word. Thank you so much. Thank you all of you. And I would say for the last word, read Stan's book, read Ministry for the Future. Bye-bye, all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Cheers, Bruce.